Night settles over East London like a heavy blanket of smoke. A damp fog clings to the narrow streets, muting the neon glow of pub signs and swallowing the sound of footsteps. Only the wail of a distant siren cuts through the silence, and even that fades quickly, as if the police themselves know better than to linger. Shop shutters rattle in the breeze, doors lock early, and not a single face dares peer from behind lace curtains. This isn't just another cold evening in the East End. It's a night ruled by fear, fear of two men whose names the locals barely dare to whisper. They are the Blundell Brothers. To most of the world, those names mean nothing. But to the people who lived under their shadow, the Blundells were more than criminals. They were a storm that could strike without warning. Street enforcers? Yes. Butchers of reputation? Absolutely. Even hardened gangsters, the kind who carried knives as casually as cigarettes, lowered their voices when speaking of them. The Kray twins may have captured headlines and inspired movies, but in these streets, another pair of brothers was carving a reputation even more vicious. The Blundells didn't crave celebrity. They thrived in the dark, where the only witnesses were those too terrified to talk. Imagine a back-alley club, late 60s. A rival gang leader, broad as a brick wall, vanishes after a tense meeting. No body is ever found. The message is clear. Cross the Blundells once, and you disappear. Police detectives knew the pattern. Smashed doors, blood on the cobblestones, terrified silence. But evidence? Almost none. Every potential witness had the same answer. I didn't see a thing. Because around here, to see was to risk your life. So who were these brothers? How did they climb from East End obscurity to become predators that even London's most feared mobsters avoided? And what twisted code drove them? Money, power, or something darker that can't be measured in pounds or pence? Tonight, we pull back the curtain on their reign of terror, the calculated brutality, the betrayals that would topple empires, and the cold efficiency that kept them just beyond the law's reach for years. This is a story of two men who built an empire on intimidation and blood. A story the tabloids barely touched, but the streets will never forget. Were the Blundell brothers truly more brutal than the Krays? By the end of this journey, you might find the answer is more chilling than you ever imagined. The East End of London in the years after the Second World War was a place of rubble and restless spirits. Bombed-out buildings still scarred the skyline, and the air smelled faintly of coal smoke and damp stone. For the Blundell family, home was a cramped flat with cracked plaster walls and a single stove that barely kept the cold at bay. Their father, a dock worker with a bad back and a worse temper, spent most nights in the pub, while their mother stitched clothes late into the evening just to keep bread on the table. Money was scarce, tempers were short, and violence lingered like a fog in the narrow streets. From the moment the brothers could walk, they understood that survival required toughness. School offered little refuge. Teachers were overworked and quick with the cane, and bullies ruled the playground. The Blundell boys, only a year apart in age, learned to fight back fast. At first, it was to defend themselves, but soon the fights became something else, a thrill, a way to command respect when nothing else in their lives offered it. By their early teens, petty theft came as naturally as breathing. They slipped coins from distracted shopkeepers, lifted bread and apples from market stalls, and treated every narrow alley as an escape route. What set them apart wasn't just the theft, it was the brazenness. They never ran far, often lingering just around the corner, daring anyone to chase them. People started to notice that these two boys were different. Fearless, or maybe reckless enough not to care. Evenings were spent roaming bomb sites and derelict warehouses, places where older kids drank cheap gin and plotted small-time hustles. The brothers listened, learned, and quietly sharpened their instincts. Street fights became their favorite pastime. At first, it was with boys their own age, but soon they were testing themselves against older, stronger opponents, winning through sheer aggression. Bruised knuckles and split lips were badges of honor. The turning point came during a winter so cold it froze the Thames at its edges. A neighborhood loan shark, notorious for bullying debtors, made the mistake of threatening their mother over an unpaid bill. The brothers waited outside the man's favorite pub until closing time. When he stumbled into the fog, they cornered him in an alley, a length of pipe hidden beneath a coat. No one knows exactly what happened in that dark passage, but the man never bothered their family again. The message spread quietly. The Blundell boys weren't to be crossed. That night taught them something no school or gang could teach. Fear was a currency more valuable than cash. Coins could be spent and stolen, but fear lingered. It opened doors, kept rivals silent, and gave them power even when their pockets were empty. From that moment, the brothers weren't just scrappy kids from the East End. They were predators who had discovered their first real weapon, a reputation. As the 1950s bled into the 60s, that lesson hardened into a philosophy. Money mattered, yes, but fear was the engine that drove it all. And the Blundell brothers were ready to use it, no matter the cost. The Blundell brothers carried the lesson of fear into young adulthood like a blade hidden in their coats. By the early 1960s, East London was teeming with opportunity for those willing to break the law and break a few bones along the way. The city's underworld thrived on vice. Gambling dens, backroom clubs, and black market goods funneled through the docks. The brothers saw not chaos, but a market, and they intended to own it. Their first move was deceptively simple: protection rackets. Local shopkeepers were tired of petty thieves and drunken brawlers smashing their windows. The Blundells offered insurance in exchange for weekly payments. At first, a few owners refused, until a butcher woke to find his storefront reduced to shards of glass and his prized delivery van mysteriously burned. After that, most paid without complaint. Word spread quickly, faster than the police could ever respond. Recruitment followed. The brothers didn't want a large crew, they wanted a loyal one. Ex-boxers who could swing a punch, dock workers who knew smuggling routes, and a few crooked policemen willing to tip them off about raids formed the backbone of their growing enterprise. Each man was chosen for his silence as much as his skill. Loyalty was enforced with brutal clarity. Anyone who spoke out risked disappearing into the night. With muscle behind them, the Blundells expanded to armed robberies and high-stakes gambling. They struck payroll deliveries, betting shops, and even small banks with clockwork precision. Planning was meticulous: stolen cars stashed in hidden garages, lookouts posted on rooftops, escape routes mapped to the second. Witnesses often described the same thing: faces hidden, movements fast, violence sudden and overwhelming. Victims were left shaken but alive, because terror was more profitable than murder. Their reputation became a weapon of its own. Rivals who once swaggered through East End pubs began to lower their eyes when the brothers entered. Competitors either joined the Blundells or quietly packed up and left. Even hardened gangsters whispered their name, aware that a single insult could invite a visit from men with iron bars and no mercy. One story became neighborhood legend. A rival gang tried to muscle in on a lucrative gambling ring the brothers controlled. Instead of an all-out war, the Blundells staged a single, unforgettable ambush. The rival leader was found beaten nearly beyond recognition. His men scattered, his operation dead overnight. No witnesses came forward. No one even called the police until long after the attackers had vanished. Unlike the flamboyant Kray twins, the Blundells avoided publicity. They dressed plainly, kept their faces out of the papers, and ran their operations in the shadows. But their low profile only deepened the fear. People couldn't pin down their habits or predict their moves, which made every encounter more unnerving. By the mid-60s, the brothers had woven themselves into nearly every illegal trade east of the Thames: stolen goods, underground betting, even nightclub security. They paid off a handful of corrupt officers to look the other way, ensuring that raids happened on their timetable. When an honest detective did try to investigate, witnesses clammed up, and evidence mysteriously disappeared. Through it all, their guiding principle remained the same: fear before fortune. Money flowed, but intimidation was the real currency. A glance, a quiet threat, the knowledge that the Blundells never forgot a face, that was worth more than any stack of banknotes. Their empire wasn't built on public notoriety or flashy headlines. It was built on the silence of a neighborhood too terrified to speak. By the time the decade reached its midpoint, the Blundell brothers were no longer just East End toughs. They were the shadow rulers of an underground economy, a power as invisible as it was untouchable. And everyone, from rival criminals to the beat cops on night patrol, understood one truth. Crossing the Blundells meant living in fear, or not living at all. East London in the mid-1960s pulsed with energy at night. Clubs packed with music, pubs brimming with dockworkers, and narrow streets alive with neon and smoke. But beneath the bustle ran a current of dread. The Blundell brothers had turned fear into an art form, and by now the entire district knew it. Their grip wasn't loud or flashy. It was silent and absolute, the kind of control that made people cross the street at the mere sight of a familiar silhouette. Shopkeepers were among the first to feel it. Many still handed over their insurance money without a word, even when business was bad. A baker on Commercial Street once tried to renegotiate his weekly payment, claiming his profit margins had shrunk. 2 nights later, his ovens were smashed and his front window shattered. He doubled the payment the following week and never mentioned it again. Stories like that traveled quickly, each one adding another layer of terror. Nightclub owners were equally trapped. The Blundells offered protection, or invasion. A refusal meant sudden fights breaking out inside the club, brawls so violent patrons fled and the police began sniffing around. The brothers didn't need to show up themselves. A single nod to their crew was enough. The mere rumor that a club was off limits to the Blundells kept crowds thin and profits lower than the cost of paying them off. Even rival gangs bent the knee. One crew from Hackney thought they could carve out a slice of the gambling trade. They boasted about their toughness in local pubs, daring the Blundells to respond. Within a week, their leader was beaten so badly he spent months in hospital, and the rest of the gang disappeared or quietly joined the Blundell network. No witnesses, no charges, just silence. The message couldn't have been clearer. Opposition meant obliteration. The brothers perfected a code of silence. They rarely spoke directly about crimes, using gestures or half-sentences instead. Their men followed the same discipline. If questioned by police, they claimed ignorance, and no one ever betrayed the pact. It wasn't loyalty born of love, it was survival. Everyone understood that talking meant retribution, not just for the informer, but for their family. The brothers made sure of it. Ordinary residents lived in a constant low hum of fear. Mothers warned children not to linger after dark, and pub regulars lowered their voices when certain names came up. People would glance over their shoulders before whispering a rumor. It wasn't unusual for a neighbor to suddenly move away without explanation, leaving a flat dark and empty overnight. Whether they'd crossed the brothers or simply feared they might, no one dared to ask. The police were painfully aware of this atmosphere. Detectives knew crimes were happening: extortion, smuggling, illegal betting, but evidence was scarce. Every time an officer tried to build a case, witnesses refused to testify or forgot details. A few honest cops attempted undercover work, but informants vanished or backed out at the last minute. The Blundells also had allies inside the force, a handful of corrupt officers who leaked information about raids, allowing the brothers to stay one step ahead. What made the Blundells even more frightening than the celebrated Kray twins was their invisibility. The Krays courted fame, posing for photos and mingling with celebrities. The Blundells preferred the dark corners, where anonymity was its own weapon. Their power thrived on uncertainty. No one knew when they might appear or how far their reach extended. This unpredictability left people even more unsettled than a headline-grabbing brawl ever could. By the late 1960s, the East End was effectively theirs. Market stalls, nightclubs, underground gambling rings, and smuggling routes all operated with the brothers' silent approval. They didn't need to shout or display wealth. Their authority was felt in every locked door and every wary glance exchanged across a dimly lit pub. Fear had become their trademark, a currency more enduring than cash and far more effective than bullets. For the people who lived under their shadow, the question wasn't whether the Blundell Brothers would strike. It was when and how. By the early 1970s, cracks began to form in the Blundell Brothers' carefully constructed empire. For years, fear had kept rivals silent and the police at bay, but power built on terror eventually breeds enemies. The brothers had ruled East London's underworld with a quiet, calculated brutality, yet even they couldn't control every variable forever. It started with money. Their operations had grown so large, protection rackets, illegal betting, smuggling, that smaller lieutenants began skimming profits. At first, the brothers responded as they always had, with swift, punishing violence. But this time, the discipline only deepened resentments. Some crew members started whispering about taking a bigger slice, or even toppling the brothers themselves. These weren't frightened teenagers anymore. They were hardened criminals with ambitions of their own. Rival gangs sensed weakness. A group from South London, emboldened by rumors of internal unrest, moved in on a lucrative gambling circuit. Instead of the usual instant retaliation, the Blundells hesitated. They were dealing with too many fires at once: crew disputes, police attention, and the growing cost of bribes to their allies in uniform. That hesitation was all their enemies needed. Fights broke out in back alleys and pubs, each clash a public signal that the Blundell Brothers were no longer untouchable. Meanwhile, law enforcement finally found a gap in the brothers' armor. After years of dead ends, a newly formed undercover task force began gathering intelligence with quiet patience. They targeted not the brothers themselves, but their network: low-level bookies, drivers, and enforcers. By flipping the least loyal members, offering reduced sentences or relocation, they began to piece together a picture of the operation. It was slow work, but every detail brought them closer. The first real breakthrough came from an unexpected source: a longtime associate arrested on an unrelated burglary charge. Facing a lengthy prison term, he agreed to talk in exchange for leniency and protection. His testimony gave detectives names, addresses, and even schedules of key operations. For the first time, the Blundell Empire had a map, and the police intended to follow it. Surveillance teams fanned out across East London. Hidden cameras captured clandestine meetings. Tapped phones revealed coded conversations. The brothers grew suspicious when a couple of minor shipments were intercepted, but they couldn't pinpoint the leak. Paranoia spread. They began moving constantly, sleeping in different flats, and holding meetings in secluded warehouses to avoid listening devices. Yet every move seemed to tighten the net around them. The decisive blow came on a cold autumn night when coordinated raids swept through their territory. Dozens of officers stormed gambling dens, safe houses, and stash spots, arresting nearly 20 members of their crew in a single night. The Blundell brothers narrowly escaped, disappearing into the maze of East End backstreets, but the damage was done. Their network was shattered, their income streams frozen, and their trusted lieutenants either in custody or on the run. For weeks they played a cat-and-mouse game with the authorities, using old smuggling routes and safe houses to stay hidden. But with every passing day, the walls closed in. Informants continued to feed detectives fresh information, and the media began to report on the mysterious East End brothers, who rivaled the Krays in brutality. Ironically, the fame they had avoided for years now worked against them, making it harder to disappear. Eventually, a tip led police to a remote farmhouse outside the city, where the brothers were believed to be regrouping. In a pre-dawn raid, armed officers surrounded the building. There was no cinematic shootout, just the sound of boots on frozen grass and the quiet surrender of two men who had once terrified an entire borough. The arrests marked the beginning of the end. The courtroom battles that followed would reveal a trail of extortion, robbery, and violence stretching back more than a decade. But on that cold morning, as they were led away in handcuffs, the reign of the Blundell Brothers was effectively over. The silence that had once shielded them had finally been broken, and East London's long nightmare was at last beginning to fade. The trial of the Blundell Brothers drew crowds that spilled into the hallways of London's Old Bailey courthouse. Reporters jostled for seats, eager to match faces to the whispered legends of two men who had ruled the East End in shadows. For years they had been phantoms, feared but rarely seen. Now they were forced into the harsh glare of courtroom lights, their once carefully guarded anonymity shattered. The prosecution laid out a meticulous case built on years of undercover work and a cascade of witness testimony. Former associates who had once sworn eternal silence now sat in the witness box, voices low but firm as they recounted extortion, violent assaults, and elaborate robberies. The brothers listened without flinching, their expressions unreadable. They had built their empire on fear. Now they faced a parade of those they had terrified, each one chipping away at the myth of their invincibility. Key moments shocked the public. One witness described the night a rival gambler was beaten nearly to death for refusing to pay protection money. Another recounted smuggling routes across the Thames and the payoff envelopes delivered to crooked officers. Physical evidence, hidden cash, weapons, and ledgers corroborated every word. The quiet efficiency that had once protected the Blundells was now the very rope tightening around them. Despite their reputation for intimidation, the brothers refrained from outbursts. Their lawyer argued that the witnesses were liars seeking lighter sentences, but the sheer weight of testimony was impossible to ignore. Jurors heard about the code of silence, the unreported beatings, the families who fled their homes overnight. Piece by piece, the picture emerged of two men who had turned fear into a business model and held an entire community hostage. When the verdict finally came, guilty on multiple counts of extortion, armed robbery, and conspiracy, the courtroom erupted. Some spectators cheered. Others simply exhaled, as if releasing years of tension. The brothers were sentenced to long prison terms, effectively ending their reign. For the first time in decades, East London shopkeepers could lock their doors at night without a silent dread in their hearts. Yet the end of the Blundell's rule did not erase their legacy. In pubs and market stalls, older residents still spoke of them in hushed tones, half in fear and half in awe. To many, the brothers remained a dark lesson. That true power isn't about wealth or fame, but about the ability to make others believe you're unstoppable. Their downfall became a cautionary tale for would-be gangsters and a case study for police on dismantling organized crime. In the years that followed, the East End changed. Redevelopment brought new housing and a fresh wave of immigrants, and the criminal landscape shifted. But the memory of the Blundells lingered. Some younger criminals tried to imitate their methods, only to find that the world had moved on and that the same climate of silence could never exist again. Surveillance technology, stronger community ties, and lessons learned from the Blundell investigation made it harder for any gang to wield such invisible control. Even behind prison walls, rumors swirled about the brothers. Some said they maintained influence from their cells. Others claimed they quietly faded into obscurity, aging men who rarely spoke of the empire they once commanded. Whichever version was true, their names remained synonymous with a particular kind of terror, less about flashy violence and more about the creeping certainty that defiance would be punished without mercy. Today, when people compare the Blundell brothers to the infamous Kray twins, opinions vary. The Krays sought fame and found it, their stories immortalized in books and films. The Blundells preferred the dark, and perhaps that made them even more frightening. They ruled without headlines, without celebrity, and for a time without challenge. Their legacy is not just a tale of crime, but a chilling reminder of how fear can become the strongest currency of all.